This special firing line debate is a production of the South Carolina ETV Network in association with SECA. This special firing line debate was made possible in part by the John M. Olin Foundation, Essex Chemical, Mobil Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line. Live, a special firing line debate from Longstreet Theater on the campus of the University of South Carolina in Columbia, site of the famous 1978 William F. Buckley Jr. Ronald Reagan debate on the future of the Panama Canal.
Good evening from the Longstreet Theater on the campus of the University of South Carolina. Welcome to a special 2-hour live firing line debate on the topic, Resolved, the right is better able to deal with the Soviets than the left. This is the 30th anniversary of public television in South Carolina, and we're pleased to be here with Henry Cawthon, the president of SCETV, and an old friend of William F. Buckley Jr.'s firing line. I'm Mike Kinsley, editor of The New Republic. Tonight is a special night for me. Like many Americans, I have long dreamed of having the occasion to utter the words, "Dr. Kissinger, your time is up." Thanks to William F. Buckley, this is my lucky night. And I have this strategic weapon on loan from a South Carolina jurist to help me out. I have a feeling he must be a strict constructionist. Over the past 22 years, William Buckley's firing line has sponsored over 50 televised debates, including the first debates among the Republican and Democratic presidential candidates last year. I think it's probably safe to say that William F. Buckley has sponsored and participated in more TV debates than George Bush has even dreamed of trying to avoid. Believers in vigorous and full-throated democracy owe Mr. Buckley and his producer Warren Steibel a debt of gratitude. Tonight's resolution is, Resolved, the right is better able to deal with the Soviets than the left. Now, that could be read to mean that the American right can handle the Soviet Union better than it can handle the American left. But I don't think that's what the framers intended. At any rate, we'll find out. Will you now please welcome this evening's debaters? Please hold your applause until there's someone you really like. Yeah. Our debaters are an extremely distinguished collection, including 3 former presidential candidates and at least 2 people who, in their own minds, would regard the presidency as a step down. And you can figure out who those are. Leading the team on the right is William F. Buckley Jr., founder and host of Firing Line, founder and editor-in-chief of the National Review, and the man without whom tonight's debate would not be possible or even necessary. Helping out Mr. Buckley this evening are former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, the world's foremost living authority on the world, former United Nations Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick, and Congressman and former presidential candidate Jack Kemp. Heading up the L-word team this evening is former Senator George McGovern, the 1972 presidential nominee of the Democratic Party, and founder of a mysterious faith called McGovernism, which only Republicans seem to really understand, or at least only seem to believe in. Helping out Senator McGovern tonight are former Senator Gary Hart, the only man in history to have run for the presidency twice in the same year, Representative Pat Schroeder, who contemplated running for the presidency and then came to her senses, and Paul Warnke, Ambassador Paul Warnke, former director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, among many other instances of distinguished public service. We will not begin this evening's festivities with the Pledge of Allegiance. Instead, we turn to Mr. Buckley.
What's the difference? Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, my distinguished guests, half drunk, half sober. I was advised this morning that several Democrats had decided to boycott the affair this evening on the grounds that our four adversaries are not representative of the Democratic Party. That was the best news I've had since Atlanta. But alas, it isn't so. It's true that Mrs. Schroeder never succeeded in getting into the competition for the presidency, and it's true that Senator Hart is clever enough to assign to other matters priority over politics. Politics, Carlyle reminded us, is the preoccupation of the quarter-educated. And it is true that George McGovern, when he did succeed in winning the Democratic presidential nomination, succeeded in winning only the state of Massachusetts, which now seeks to avenge him. It is not unhappily true that the positions on foreign policy adopted by our guest are alien to those adopted by the Democratic representative for president. Writing in the New Republic, the liberal counterpart of National Review, whose editor presides over us all tonight, Mr. Morton Kondracki wrote just last week, quotes, Governor Dukakis's foreign policy is pure McGovern. On every issue, arms control to the Persian Gulf, Dukakis's positions are foursquare with those of Ted Kennedy and the rest of the Massachusetts congressional delegation, which is to say, on the left end of the Democratic Party. Now, it's not our fault that Sam Nunn wasn't nominated in Atlanta, or Bill Bradley, or for that matter, Jack Kennedy or Harry Truman. If these last two gentlemen were sitting here tonight, there is simply no doubt on which side of the aisle they would stand, either with us or else they would need to repudiate the whole of their public record. The resolution bids us to argue that the right is better able to deal with the Soviets than the left. The right, as used here tonight, is a rough synonym for George Bush, and the left is the mistress of Michael Dukakis. Perhaps the question of the left's failures to move effectively are satisfactorily summed up by the famous French expression, pas d'ennemi à gauche. The left has no true enemies on the left. Thus, George McGovern proclaims the high virtues of Fidel Castro, as of course does Michael Dukakis's true running mate, Jesse Jackson, who toasted not only the health and idealism of Castro, but also that of Che Guevara. One sees this instinctive desire to leave the left alone and to make up for it by fustian opposition to what is thought to be the right. Thus, the Duke of Massachusetts uses against the totalitarian dictator of Nicaragua only gentle reproaches, while Shining Path Dukakis brands South Africa as a terrorist state. Mike Dukakis refuses 10 invitations even to visit the Hanscom Air Force Base, the premier military facility in Massachusetts, and Mr. Dukakis prevents Massachusetts from participating in the ground wave emergency network. His charming excuse for this is that to organize America's defenses against nuclear attack is tacitly to assume that we are willing to conceive the possibility of a nuclear exchange. In closing, it is what the psychologists call a syndrome. If you think about the military, you become militaristic. If you support the freedom fighters in Nicaragua, you are engaging in imperialism. If you liberate Grenada, you violate the Rio Pact. If you guard the sea lanes in the Persian Gulf, you are snubbing the United Nations. Mr. Chairman, the voters will spare us, I am sure, the awful alternative. Pero mientras tanto, tenemos la obligación de cuidarnos con mucho cuidado. So it is our duty to take care that in a pitch of forgetfulness or caprice, or of petulance, the people should vote for old Shining Path Dukakis, when the alternative is so very compelling, so as attractive to America as it is unattractive to America's enemies. Mr. Chairman, I yield the floor.
Mr. Buckley, muchas gracias for the plug for the New Republic, but I have to warn people, don't believe everything you read in the New Republic, because I certainly don't. Mr. McGovern, you now have 3 minutes to make the rest of this evening superfluous with your reply.
Good.
may be wondering what all of us are doing here tonight in a national debate. But frankly, we got so tired waiting for George Bush to agree to a presidential debate, we decided to take matters into our own hands tonight. I should like at the outset to define the terms left and right as they're used in this debate. The left is not, as defined in Europe, socialism or communism, just as the right is not fascism. The left in this debate means Democrats. The right means Republicans. Mr. Buckley has told you that I'm a McGovern Democrat, which will come as no great surprise. I think this simply means that I'm a liberal, and I'm old-fashioned enough to believe that the Democratic Party stands for liberalism, the Republican Party stands for conservatism. We need both of those traditions in the United States. But I think it's fair to say that Mr. Buckley will vote for George Bush unless he can revive Genghis Khan, and I will vote for Michael Dukakis. To define the right as synonymous with republicanism is, of course, to say that it's really wrong, especially in its dealings with the Soviet Union. So let's look at the record. A 70-year record going back to the birth of the Soviet government in 1918. The Democrats under FDR opened up relations with the Soviet Union in 1933. The Republicans under Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover had no dealings with the Soviet Union. They didn't even recognize their existence. The Democrats under Roosevelt and Truman organized victory over Hitler, including the coalition with the Soviet Union. And I think all here can agree that without the huge Soviet army and the loss of 20 million Russian lives, it is doubtful if the West could have prevailed against the onslaught of Hitler. The Republican right believed that we should have gone to war against both the Nazis and the Russians, a formula that might have led to the death of 20 million Americans and perhaps the possible loss of World War II. The Democrats under Roosevelt and Truman established the United Nations, which has helped prevent World War III for 40 years, is now settling the conflict between Iran and Iraq and arranging the withdrawal of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan. The Republican right regards the UN as a menace, and under the Reagan administration doesn't even pay its dues. We're now in arrears some $467 million in overdue obligations. The Democrats have led the way in establishing the NATO alliance and the Marshall Plan to preserve the peace and develop the West. The Republican right scorned the NATO alliance and the Marshall Plan and still does. The Democrats created the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency to bring the arms race under control. They led the way under Kennedy to the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, supported the ABM. Mr. Buckley took 4 minutes, so I am too. Negotiated the SALT II treaty under President Carter. The Republican right has opposed every effort at arms control and supported every new weapons boondoggle, including the unflyable B-1, the unnecessary MX, and the cockeyed Star Wars. Mr. Reagan, after putting missiles into Europe, is now busy taking them out. The Republican right has opposed every arms control negotiation except the INF Treaty, and they're not so sure about that. Beyond all of this, at a time when the key challenge to both the Soviet Union and the United States is to strengthen our economies at home and abroad, the Republican right has led the way in an unnecessary and wasteful military buildup that has added nothing to our security, but added much to our national debt and the weakening of our economic competitive position in the world.
Thank you, Senator McGovern. Dr. Kissinger will now have an opportunity for an opening statement, and then the great pleasure of being interrogated by our friends on the left.
Chairman, and ladies and gentlemen. Fundamentally, I believe in bipartisanship in foreign policy as it was practiced in the Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy administration. I don't believe that our national values and our national interests change every 4 years. While I would describe myself as a conservative, I have experienced the wrath of some conservatives, including one or two of my colleagues on this panel. I have also felt free to criticize the views of specific conservatives, as I did a few weeks ago in Inside magazine, though none of my colleagues on this panel. But in the past 2 decades, to my regret, a widening gulf has opened up in our national debate. This year's presidential campaign poses, in my view, the most profound philosophical issues of the post-war period. I must comment about the observation of Senator McGovern that the Democrats added the force of the Soviets to the anti-Hitler alliance. What added the force of the Soviets to the anti-Hitler alliance was Hitler. And the Soviets made the most strenuous efforts to avoid having to join this, and indeed had made a proposition to Hitler that they wanted to get a major role in Eastern Europe and in the Persian Gulf and in the Straits, which did not succeed, so they took as much as they could after the war. I have read everything I could find on foreign and national security policy uttered by Governor Dukakis, which is admittedly a skimpy body of work. Just one more sentence. I'm convinced that the philosophy he stands for, national security, is incompatible with a strong America, that his approach to East-West relations would undermine our ability to move the Soviet Union toward a more responsible behavior, and his views on international affairs would keep us from shaping the new world which 4 decades of American dedication have brought into view. That, I think, is the real debate tonight between right and left.
Dr. Kissinger, your time is up. Would someone like to ask Dr. Kissinger a question? Mr. Hart, Senator Hart.
Secretary Kissinger, is there any circumstance under which the strategic interests of the United States and the Soviet Union might correspond, and if so, what are they?
It depends how you define the strategic interests of the Soviet Union and the United States. We both have an interest in avoiding nuclear war, but we cannot permit the fear of nuclear war to be the only determinant of our foreign policy, because we also have to stand for freedom and justice. I could conceive that a Soviet Union that stays within its territorial borders, a territory that includes 11 time zones, so that it should not exactly inspire claustrophobia, could come to an understanding with the United States on the basis of national interest. An expansionist Soviet Union would find it very difficult to have coinciding strategic interests.
Do you believe it's in our interest for Mikhail Gorbachev to succeed? And if not, why not?
I do not believe in the psychiatric approach to foreign policy.
Well, I didn't mention psychiatry.
No, I do not believe that first of all, one has to define what one means by Mikhail Gorbachev to succeed.
Well, if we had more than 30 seconds,
no, making the Soviet Union, solving the problems of the Soviet economy is obviously in the Soviet interest.
Is it in our interest?
what is in our interest is a restrained Soviet foreign policy. And I think what we have to concentrate on is Soviet foreign policy and not Soviet domestic policy. And I would judge Gorbachev by his conduct in foreign affairs and not primarily by his conduct in domestic affairs, which is in part imposed on him by the abject conditions of 60 years of mismanagement.
Okay, Senator McGovern.
Secretary Kissinger, you worked very hard some years ago to convince the Soviets not to build a defensive anti-ballistic missile system. The result was the bipartisan ABM treaty. Do you see the proposal by President Reagan to move ahead with a defensive ABM system of our own a contradiction in what we were trying to do some years ago?
Well, George, I am very grateful for the credit you're giving me. When the administration in which I served came into office, we proposed an ABM agreement, an ABM deployment. This passed with one vote in the Senate. Then this deployment was reduced gradually from 12 sites to 2 sites. So it's not, we would have probably preferred to go forward with our deployment and negotiate from that basis. We then agreed to settle on 2 ABM sites. That was in 1972. I believe that it makes no sense to base the defense of the United States on strategic weapons and to tell our public that we will do nothing to defend them against third country attacks, protection of our missile forces, and I have absolutely no understanding for the proposition that SDI is bad, but the Soviet anti-aircraft system is tolerable. So I am in support of the concept of SDI. Its particular applications we can talk about later.
Thank you, Dr. Kissinger. We have to move on. It's now Ambassador Warnke's opportunity. It's your opportunity, sir, to make an opening statement and then be interrogated by friends on the right.
I find a fatal flaw in the resolution, and that's the fact that the right has no interest in dealing with the Soviets, and in fact has never done so. A year ago last May, Congressman Jack Kemp referred to the pendency of the INF Treaty and referred to it as a nuclear Munich. He said what it would do would be to issue a warrant of respectability for Gorbachev. Mr. Buckley just yesterday in his column in the Washington Post said that the support of the Joint Chiefs for adherence to the ABM Treaty made them 3 blind mice. Now, under these circumstances, it seems to me that the question ought to be a very different question indeed. The major accomplishment of the Reagan administration in the arms control field is the INF Treaty. Was that achieved by the right? It was accomplished under the leadership of Secretary of State George Shultz, for whose resignation Congressman Jack Kemp has called. The chief negotiators included a couple of long-lived Democrats, Paul Nitze, who served in the Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson administrations, Max Kampelman, who served with this notorious rightist. He was an aide to Senator Hubert Humphrey for very, very many years. And the other chief negotiators were career Foreign Service officers. In previous administrations, both Republican and Democratic moderates have dealt successfully with the Soviets, while the right-wingers have carped and criticized and even questioned their patriotism. Despite promising signs that Mr. Gorbachev wants to see a real improvement in East-West relations, we're going to have serious differences. The question is, do we want to have ideologues of the right or the left, or sensible moderates like Henry Kissinger and me?
Thank you. No, Mr. Warnke, you're still on. I saw Mrs. Kirkpatrick.
I thought I had answered all the questions.
Well, they think you were trying to sneak away. Mrs. Kirkpatrick, you were scribbling away. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do, actually. Paul, I think one of us misread Bill Buckley's column yesterday morning on the Joint Chiefs. I understood him not to criticize the Joint Chiefs for respecting the ABM Treaty, but to suggest that veiled criticism, mild criticism for their resistance to the advanced technology of SDI. Are you sure that your understanding was in fact correct?
I believe so. I think that what Mr. Buckley said was that they were three blind mice in respect of the utter suicidal folly of the ABM's treaty being kept alive in 1988. Now, I like the ABM treaty. I liked it when Henry concluded it. I like it today. So I believe I've given a perfectly accurate depiction.
And you like its violations, and you feel that they have
Oh, no, I think the Krasnoyarsk radar is a
treaty.
clear violation of the ABM treaty. It ought to be taken down. I think we can get them to take it down.
We have the world's living expert on the interpretation of William F. Buckley sitting right here. Would you like to dive in here?
Since my name has been mentioned
I hope I don't interfere in either of your interpretations of what I wrote. It is a commonplace, Mr. Warnke, that generals are always occupied fighting the most recent war. And this was not said by me, but it was said before I was born. And I think that it is correct, and I don't think you will really challenge this, that the Secretary of Defense, both the current one and his predecessor, feel that if we cannot proceed with a broad interpretation of the ABM Treaty, then we ought to scrap it.
I think that is correct, but I think that they're both incorrect. The fact of the matter is there is no technology at the present point that is worth deploying. Now, I've read with interest the letter that was signed by Henry Kissinger, Spig Brzezinski, a number of other people, in favor of going ahead with a deployment that complies with the ABM Treaty. Testing out 100, which is permitted by the ABM Treaty, ground-based systems, and testing them with new technology. I'm not against that. I'm not against continued research on ABM technology. What I'm saying is that to spend whatever it is at the present point and frustrate any chance of substantial reductions in offensive forces, reducing the Soviet nuclear threat, makes no sense whatsoever.
Mr. Kemp, do you want to dive in
Thank
here?
you. I would like to. Paul, how is it possible to get the Soviets to stop violating the ABM Treaty, to stop violating the Helsinki Human Rights Accord, to stop violating everything going back to Yalta? How is it possible to get them to stop violating SALT I, SALT II, and to bring down the Krasnoyarsk radar and comply with the human rights provisions of Helsinki, unless this country makes sure that in any negotiations with the Soviet Union, we require that they comply with previous treaties before we enter a new treaty? Are you suggesting here tonight that we should continue to negotiate and to sign a new treaty absent compliance with previous treaty obligations of the Soviet Union?
The fact of the matter is that both the CIA and the State Department and the Department of Defense have concluded that the record of the Soviet Union and of the United States is a good record in terms of compliance with existing treaties.
The United States?
And the United States, too, yes.
Well, of course the United States. What about the Soviet Union? What does Paul
There have
Warnke
been
think?
some questions in the past.
Helsinki?
There always are.
Helsinki?
That basket 3, which is precatory and not obligatory, as Secretary
That's going to
Kissinger
be
knows
news
very,
to
very
all.
well indeed.
Well,
You shouldn't sign things
Covenant on
that
Human
say
Rights.
that you don't have to abide by it. And that's what basket 3 of the Helsinki Accord says.
What a
All right, thank-
The
disappointment.
one
Thank
clear
you.
violation is the
disappointment.
Krasnoyarsk
Okay, you
radar,
guys.
where I insist
Thank
that it be
you.
taken down.
Thank
Can
you.
I leave now?
Yes, you can leave now. And I can only hope. We can only hope that at some time in the course of the evening we'll find out what precatory means. But right now we are going to have a one-on-one standoff between Mrs. Kirkpatrick and Mr. Hart, and each one will make an opening statement, and then they will go at each other for a few minutes. According to my program, Mrs. Kirkpatrick goes first.
I think the question that we're addressing is a straightforward one, whether the right is better in dealing with the Soviet Union than the left. Now, whether by better in dealing with the Soviet Union, we mean discouraging Soviet aggression and expansion, or whether by better we mean improving relations with the Soviet Union and stabilizing them, negotiating agreements, whichever we mean by better, the right does better. I think that's manifestly true. The fact is, George McGovern suggested we look at the record. Let's look at the record. The fact is that U.S. relations with the Soviet Union were better under Dwight Eisenhower than under Harry Truman, better under Richard Nixon than under Kennedy Johnson, and they are better under Ronald Reagan than they were under Jimmy Carter. It's an interesting record. Better in both senses. Better in the sense that there is less Soviet expansion, aggression, fewer people sucked into the Soviet empire. Better in the sense that they are more stable and finally more positive and with more positive agreements being reached. I believe that Republican presidents deal better with the Soviets because they deal from realism and they deal from strength. The Soviets understand it and they know where they are. Creates stability and diminishes misunderstanding. Unfortunately, I think the left confuses the Soviets as much as it often confuses the rest of us.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I join our colleagues in thanking South Carolina Educational Television and all those who have brought us here, including Mr. Buckley. I was struck by his statement, however, because, among other things, he failed to address the issue before us. And I thought the reason he did was because it has been said that conservatives are the worshipers of dead radicals. I'm not sure that Roosevelt, Truman, and Kennedy were radicals, but they certainly have come into the litany of those who are worshipped by the right in this country. I disagree strongly with the suggestion or implication that were they here tonight, they would be on that side of the aisle rather than this. I can't imagine any of the three of them campaigning for George Bush or supporting the proposition that a fringe element in our country is best equipped to deal with the Russians. The fact of the matter is this. The Democratic Party has always been the agent of change, and the central fact of our time is that we're living in a period of enormous change. The new realities of our time are diffusion of power away from the superpowers, the emergence of global nationalism, particularly in the third world, and the emergence of a global economy. The challenge to us as Americans is to forget about the right and the left and do what we have always done at our best, and that is find the process for change, the new framework for a foreign policy. I believe we can use those new realities to negotiate arrangements with the other superpower in our national interest, using nationalism, using that global economy, and in fact using the diffusion of power to help stabilize the relationship, which is our ultimate goal. The Democratic Party demonstrably has been able to do that in the past, and it will do so in the future.
Thank you, Senator Hart. Now, Mrs. Kirkpatrick, you have a question for Senator Hart.
Well, like I said, the left often confuses us, him. I think I'm going to ignore your statement because I'm not sure what I would ask you about it, and ask you instead whether you find yourself in agreement with Michael Dukakis's stated security and defense programs.
As they've been outlined, I think so. What I think, as a constructive critic of his, I would urge is something more explicit in terms of how to reform our conventional defenses in very specific ways to make them effective, what the priorities of arms control are to reduce the nuclear threat and war by accident, which is in fact the threat, and how he would go about dealing with third world debt and the other legacy of the Reagan administration.
Would you propose to begin, as I understand he's committed to doing, by unilateral cuts in major American weapon systems? And would you expect different results than occurred during the Carter years from that policy?
What I would support, as I did for 12 years as a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee and an individual strongly committed to this nation's security, was not buying weapon systems that don't make any sense. Where the vast majority of the American people are is not on the right or on the left. They are in the center, as Mr. Warnke and Mr. Kissinger have already staked out. And what they want is common sense. They want weapon systems that work. The B-1 bomber doesn't work. It's no longer a penetrating bomber. It costs too much. It doesn't fly well. It has all sorts of problems. Why buy it?
And Midget Man and MX and the proposed submarine carriers.
Well, do you really think it makes sense to put a 10-warhead missile in a silo that the Soviets already can target? I mean, what is the argument for that?
No, I understand
That's
that
the MX.
that issue here is mobile missiles, mobile MX now.
Well, no.
That's
Midget
what
Man
I
is the mobile
understand is now
missile. MX is the
scheduled,
fixed silo
and
missile.
what is now being proposed, that Governor Dukakis is proposing to begin with unilateral cuts, not with negotiations, but with unilateral cuts, and to move from those unilateral cuts to negotiations on further arms agreements.
This nation
Would
has
you agree
always
with that,
sized,
Mr. Hart?
no. This nation has always sized its strategic forces based upon what we, including our senior military commanders, think is in our national security interest. We don't build everything that can be built and then try to negotiate it away. First of all, we can't afford the debt. Remember the debt, the Reagan debt? Somebody's going to have to pay for all these things. And it's not this administration.
When, yes, debt. I think it is interesting that about the only way many people on the left can think about reducing the debt is with unilateral defense cuts.
Wrong. No, that's wrong.
It's the only thing you've suggested so far this evening.
Well, we aren't here to debate the debt, but I'd be more than happy to, since I would think your side would not want to touch that issue, frankly. But
Oh, I'm quite comfortable.
Mr. Hart, you're free now to go on the offensive, and you don't just have to answer her questions anymore for the next 3 minutes.
let me read Mrs. Kirkpatrick a quote. It goes as follows. The federal budget squeeze during the Reagan years has forced deep cuts in economic aid abroad, reducing U.S. influence. And the Reagan policies have, until recently, ignored the fundamental economic power shifts in the world. Over the past 8 years, the administration has plunged the U.S. into debt and trade deficits, permitting the third world debt burden to fester, and failed to craft a coherent overall policy toward America's greatest economic competitor, Japan. That quotation is from the front page, not of the New Republic, but the Wall Street Journal. Do you agree or disagree?
Oh, the aspects of it that I would agree with and aspects of it I would disagree with.
Which
quite
ones do you
frankly.
disagree with?
I disagree, in fact, with the description of the origins of debt, and I note with interest that there is little account taken of the trade policies, for example, and right. There was little account taken of developments. It attributes to the Reagan administration a good many developments in global economics, which the Reagan administration has, in fact, not dealt with adequately, perhaps. Nobody has, but which, in fact, was created by others beyond the Reagan administration. Was not created by Reagan administration policies, I think.
So you fundamentally disagree with the Wall Street Journal's analysis of this administration's record?
No, I simply would not give the Reagan administration the blame for the creation of all of the economic problems which are described in that statement, no matter where it came from.
Let me ask you to choose, if you had to, in negotiating with the Soviet Union between us perpetuating Star Wars and achieving a START agreement. If you had to choose between continuing Star Wars or a verifiable START agreement, which would you choose?
Oh, that's a very easy choice for me. I do not believe the United States, any president, should forego the development of a defense against nuclear missiles from other countries. And I believe what you call Star Wars, I call a missile defense. And I believe we need a missile defense more than we need anything in the national security realm.
Anything?
Not simply.
So the price you're willing to pay for that is the Soviets keeping 50% of their arsenal.
Okay, all right. On that rhetorical note, thank you both. It's now, thank you. It's now Jack Kemp's opportunity to make an opening statement and then play a bit of defense for a few minutes.
I want to say a word on behalf of the doves of the world, heavily armed right-wing doves of the world. It is true that the real debate is how do you preserve and promote and protect the peace. And certainly the lesson of our lifetime, and certainly the lesson of the last 50 years, is that there's only one way to preserve the strength or peace of the world, and that's by keeping this country's defenses strong and, of course, to make our economy even stronger. It's interesting that in 1988, as we debate right and left, we have the most visible manifestation of that debate taking place in the presidential campaign, as has been alluded to by Henry Kissinger and Bill Buckley and Jeane Kirkpatrick. I was fascinated by your quote, Gary. I read the Democratic platform the other day, and from 1960, and was absolutely astounded to find out that in 1960, the Democratic Party supported the freedom fighters, explicit support for the freedom fighters of Hungary. In 1960, they strongly supported the modernization of our strategic nuclear deterrent, and in 1960, the Democratic Party proudly celebrated the imposition of the Monroe Doctrine against any outside interference into our hemisphere. John F. Kennedy, you suggested that we like to quote him. We do, particularly when he says things that have eternal value, which is that we should pay any price, bear those burdens, and meet the obligation in the defense of human liberty. And I want to suggest here tonight that, in my view, Michael Dukakis has dropped like a stone in current public opinion because the American people believe the Kennedy wing of the Democratic Party, not the Dukakis wing of the Democratic Party. And he has said in his statements that he would not pay the price of freedom in our hemisphere, much less the rest of the world. He is not for modernizing our strategic nuclear deterrent. He is not for the Monroe Doctrine in Central America. He is for either the Arias Doctrine or the Rio Treaty or the UN. Does anybody in this audience, is there anybody in America today that really believes is going to be the United Nations that's going to bring peace and freedom and justice and democracy to Central America? I don't. I think the people are going to elect and vote for George Bush, not Michael Dukakis, on that very issue in 1988.
Thank you, Congressman. Don't leave. Don't leave. Mr. McGovern, do you have a question?
Jack, it's interesting to me, as it was to Gary Hart, to hear all this praise of deceased Democrats. You weren't so kind to Harry Truman and Jack Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey and others when they were alive. It's after they're gone that you discover their virtues. But do you...
George, I will suspect that when Ronald Reagan leaves office, you'll be a lot kinder to him when he leaves than you were when he was alive and ready and serving as President of the United States.
Let's put it this way, I'll have good reason to be more relieved than I am.
I wouldn't be surprised someday, George, if you don't quote Ronald Reagan. I'm looking forward to the day.
I've quoted him a few times. But with regard to the point I'm trying to make here, do you honestly believe if John Kennedy could some way come back tonight that he'd be out campaigning for George Bush instead of Michael Dukakis?
I wasn't making that point. I was simply making the point that John F. Kennedy made the statement, and it was a wise one, that this country has a stake in the cause of freedom and democracy in our hemisphere and in the world. Right. And to me, it is a shock that the modern-day Democratic Party is neutral with regard to what happens in Central America. I think it's a vital part of our neighborhood and our hemisphere, and they want to turn their back on it, and I think that's a big mistake for the future of freedom in this
Mr.
hemisphere.
Warnke, do you have a question?
Yes, wouldn't you make a difference, Congressman Kemp, between Soviet intervention and popular revolutions?
I definitely would.
Yes. And is
suggesting-
it your opinion that the Nicaraguan situation is solely a result of Soviet intervention?
Let me ask you.
I mean, people are fed up down there. They've had it.
No doubt about it.
They're tired of exploitation.
Having served with
And
him,
we're coming in on the wrong side. Now, what we ought to do is make it very clear to the Soviet Union that we will not tolerate any Soviet military base there or sophisticated Soviet military equipment. They won't replay the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I think that what the right is doing at this point is intensifying a civil war in Nicaragua at tremendous cost to the people of Nicaragua. And I'm against it.
Let's call that a question.
I had the pleasure and honor of serving on the Kissinger Commission along with Jeane Kirkpatrick and a number of Democrats and Republicans.
I read the report.
And it was a very thoughtful one, but it established the fact that there are two revolutions going on in our hemisphere. A revolution of rising expectations, a revolution that is probably inspired as much by Thomas Jefferson as anyone else, and it's a revolution upon whose side we should be. And it's taking place right now. Democratic governments, fragile, are growing in Central and Latin America, and we should be on their side with economic assistance, with trade. I am a supporter, as was the Kissinger Commission, in a hemispheric free trade zone. And that's happened under, or the chances of it happening are a lot better under Ronald Reagan than they've been under any other president in a long time. But there's an outside revolution being promoted by the Soviet Union. I'd ask you, Paul, why are the Bulgarians, the PLO, the East Germans, the Soviet Union, and the Cubans in Nicaragua if it isn't to establish a Soviet beachhead in our hemisphere?
As I said before, there's no chance they could do it. We wouldn't let them do it.
Senator Hart, do you have a question for Congressman Kemp?
Only to note that now we've added Jefferson to the list of the Republicans.
That's correct.
I know for a fact if he were here today, he'd be on our side.
No, not a chance.
No doubt reciting the Pledge of Allegiance.
I'd like to ask this, if I may. Truman was quoted as saying this about Vietnam. Truman was asked whether he contemplated intervention in Vietnam to the same degree it intervened in Greece and Turkey under the so-called Truman Doctrine of 47. His reply was, absolutely not. What do you make of that?
Well, maybe not, Gary. But let's not forget that in 1946, 47, and 48, the beginning of the Reagan Doctrine, or the Truman Doctrine, the Jackson Doctrine, that scoop, not Jesse, was for this country on a bipartisan basis to support those men and women who are fighting for freedom around the world. The Afghan Mujahideen, the freedom fighters in Angola, the freedom fighters in Cambodia, and you and your party recently have opposed every single effort that this country has made to liberate Grenada, to strike at Gaddafi, to flag the ships in the Persian Gulf, and to give aid to the freedom fighters other than Afghanistan.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you.
Thank you. Congresswoman Pat Schroeder, 90 seconds of offense, 5.5 minutes of defense. Go ahead.
Right. Thank you very much. Let me say, I think what we really should be talking about a bit, rather than who is on whose side and who's quoting whom and what, we're really talking about a presidential election and what the President of the United States is supposed to do. And I think the President of the United States is supposed to do two things. Number one, protect American interests and keep us strong. And number two, be the leader on a planet of democracies. And that may be what we're missing. What we mean by democracies Yes, the Democrats have had a very strong record of standing up for countries that looked like they were moving to democracies. But when they saw a country where the only difference they could see between the ins and the outs were that one was in and the other was out, they don't go line up with one group of brutes versus the other group of brutes. And if you go back and look at traditional Republican doctrine, they would agree. Eisenhower was one of the foremost in going out and saying, don't forget military power is very important, but so is economic power. And if you totally overextend, you can totally undercut your military. He said that over and over, as did Taft, as did many others. We're in 1988, ladies and gentlemen. We are looking at a European group that we should be very proud of. We stayed after World War II, and we helped rebuild our allies in Europe and in Japan that were killing our young men. No other country in the world has done that. They were killing our young men, and we had leaders that stood up and said, you're not going to get to come home, we're going to take even more money from you, and we're going to rebuild these countries. No one's ever seen that. That's our American heritage. That's what we stand for, and we should never forget it. And yes, Mr. Kennedy said, we are not going to allow Soviet bases in our hemisphere, and we all agree with that, and we wouldn't allow Soviet bases in our hemisphere. But he also dealt with the Alliance for Progress, and he also dealt with cooperation. And I think that's the piece that we're missing, and my time is up.
That's it. Don't leave, though. Don't leave, though. Thank you. Dr. Kissinger, do you have a question for the Congresswoman?
When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Churchill was asked what position he would take with respect to that. And he said if Hitler invaded hell, he would find something friendly to say about the devil. And that suggested that there were some fundamental strategic interests which Britain would defend and would cooperate with, even if it did not reflect its preference. Now, is there anything in the world in which the United States would act in a similar way? You put the issue entirely in terms of, do we support democracies against dictatorships? Of course, we prefer that. But are there any strategic interests we have in the world which we have to defend, no matter what happens?
Oh, of course we do.
And what are they?
Well, I think we all know what they are. Obviously, oil is very important to the entire free world, but not just to us, the entire free world. And the entire free world is now economically able to help us defend it. And yet we go around and beg them to let us do it for them. I mean, I don't get that. Now that they're mature, senior partners, they can put their coins on the table. They can help a little bit. 1945 is not 1988. So, yes, oil is very important. There's all sorts of regions with strategic minerals that are important, and you do have to look at that. But when you move the strategic part away, and then you just look at countries that don't have those strategic materials, then I think we got to look at democracies. And I think that's what we need to be doing, rather than just saying, well, we'll call anyone a freedom fighter. I'm offended when the Contras are equated with our forefathers. I mean, that makes me cringe.
But may I ask just one follow-up question? Would you then say, in the Persian Gulf, if we cannot get the Europeans to support us, then we should let the oil go?
Dr. Kissinger, if I had been President of the United States, the first thing that would have happened is when the Kuwaitis called me and said, if you don't come over here and reflag our ships, we'll call the Russians. I'd say, why don't you do that? Have you ever seen a Russian royal family? I mean, ridiculous. Under communism, you think you're going to keep your oil company? You think you're going to keep your throne? Come on. Instead, we panicked and said, oh, they dialed 1-800-USA. We're on our way, you know. Then once we're in, and we're in there big, then we start saying to our allies, you guys should come too, you know, you all have a piece of this. Well, after I had returned that phone call and said that, then I would have also gotten a hold of our allies, Japan and Western Europe, who are terribly dependent on that oil, and said, you have a piece of this action too. What are we gonna do? Once you sail in, they just say, well, you did it, you're there one more time. Nice to see you there, big brother. It's like somebody grabbing your check at the restaurant.
Well, of course, they did join us.
Mr. Buckley.
Mrs. Schroeder, the historical perspective here is becoming difficult to manage.
No, I'm trying to be in the future.
You talk a lot about
in the
introducing
future.
democracy to this hemisphere. Are you aware that in 1976, 30% of Latin America was democratically run? Today, in the last days of Mr. Reagan, 90% is right. Are you aware when you... are you aware when you complain with your newfound concern for husbandry in your party about overspending that Jack Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon over a thing called the missile gap? Because we were only spending 9.5% of our GNP, and he wanted to spend 10% on the GNP. Are you aware that we're now spending 6%, 6.2% of the GNP? Are you aware that Walter Mondale in 1984 said that we should have an increase of 4% absolute in our defense expenditures? We're now down to -3%. Wouldn't it really help the plausibility of your case if you came to terms with historical realisms of this order?
Mr. Buckley. I hate to break this to you, I'm female, but I also am aware of math. And yes, I'm aware of those things, but there's some other things that you need to be aware of. Our tremendous trade deficit that's been driven, it's absolutely incredible. When Ronald Reagan took office, foreign countries owed us money. Now we owe them money. That we have increased this debt by an absolutely phenomenal percentage. You know, I used to say the Democrats tax and spend, tax and spend. You guys borrow and spend. That's much worse, much worse. And I think you can say that maybe we tax and spend, but we had the guts to say if we needed these things, we're going to pay for these things rather than rolling them over on our kids or what other generation. And you can quote other countries, you can do other things. The problem with your economics is you also have to look at the savings rate in those countries. Ours is much less. And you have to look at what they spend their money on.
Thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman. I now call upon William F. Buckley, Jr. and George McGovern to take the stand.
George, do I embarrass you first? Or
Right ahead. Right ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Buckley.
Every time Senator McGovern talks about Star Wars, he contrives an expression in his face of such utter contempt that I find myself wondering, what did Star Wars ever do to you? Now, I'd like to ask you this question. Do you dispute that the Soviet Union has spent an estimated $150 billion trying to establish a Star Wars system, and why have they done this?
Well, I think it indicates that there's folly on both sides. I have never argued that the Soviets have consistently good judgment. And if they've spent if I'm accepting your assertion here that they've spent $150 billion on a boondoggle similar to SDI, then I'd say that's a cause for cheers. We have less to fear if they're that stupid.
Well, but Senator, this seems to me to arise out of a kind of internal dogmatism. You're saying it's not going to work. Now, you're not King Canute. You can't stand up there and prove that that you can't stop the tides and give us that kind of a demonstration. There have been extraordinary technological achievements in SDI. Why don't you acknowledge those, and why don't you cheer them on?
Well, let me say I take the same position that Paul Warnke does, that a systematic research program is all right. That doesn't cost $150 billion, and I don't think the Soviets have spent anything like that. We had a research program going under the Democrats. This is not something that the Reagan administration invented. What they invented was the determination to scuttle other forms of arms control that would give more security to the American people in order to move ahead beyond the research stage at a time when we still haven't got the answers that justify moving beyond research.
It's difficult for you to say that, given the historic achievements, by your standards, of the current administration in more effective reductions than have ever been arrived at before. But what I don't understand is, what is it inside you that makes you comfortable with the idea that our protections, that our freedom rests on our ability to kill 100 million Russians?
Bill,
Why don't you welcome an alternative to mutual assured destruction?
Bill, you know, and I hope you know, and I think anyone that's thought it through does know, that any effort to build up a defensive system is always going to provoke an effort on the part of the other side to overwhelm it. That's why we tried to persuade the Soviets in the first instance not to go for a defensive system, and I think that was a sound objective on our part. The only security against nuclear weapons is to make sure that they're never used. You're not going to get safety building some kind of an Astrodome over the United States.
The whole purpose of the space shield is to make it perpetually unprofitable for the Soviet Union to launch a first strike. That is the whole reasoning behind that.
Bill, what
initiative.
makes a nuclear war unprofitable on both sides is that nobody survives. If the Soviets were to launch a first strike against us with or without the ABM system, no Russian would survive it. Neither would any American if we were so foolish as to go the other way.
They certainly would have survived it if we had followed your recommendations over the past 25 years. Well, beginning when you voted for Henry Wallace in 1948, who wanted to disarm completely, going up through wanting to reduce the Defense Department by 25%.
Let me say that Henry Wallace was always for a strong national defense. I'm glad that you've given us this important information that I supported him as a college student.
Well, we were
I
talking
also
about
stole a watermelon when I was 14 years old. Let's get it all out here on the record tonight. But the only...
While we're getting it all out, Senator, you're now free to launch a retaliatory strike at any time.
All right. I've got a few questions, Bill. You're the leader of the Republican team, or as we unfortunately refer to the right team. I don't like these terms, right and left, as I hope I've made clear. But anyway, on your team, Jeane Kirkpatrick told the Republican convention here a few days ago, it's fair to say that American relations with the Soviet Union have never been better. Now, another member of your team said shortly before that, and I'm quoting Jack Kemp, too many in this administration have taken the easy way out, fostering false hopes. Soviet aggression continues. Soviet espionage has become more brazen, and Soviet terrorism and subversion more widespread. Now, who are we to believe? Congressman Kemp or Mrs.
No, they're utterly reconcilable. In the first instance, it's true that when you have the President of the United States going and getting the kind of reception in the Kremlin, which has no precedent in our in our relations, there is obviously an improvement in the sense in which we can communicate with the leader of the Soviet Union. It's also true that they seek always to exploit any sign of weakness by us to continue their massive assault on freedom everywhere in the world. So I would say that both Mrs. Kirkpatrick and Jack Kemp were absolutely correct. It is a complementarity.
We used to have a congressman who reminded me of you, Bill. He'd be making a speech on the House floor, and someone would get up and flatly contradict him. I mean 180-degree contradiction. He'd say, well, ain't that what I'm trying to tell you? Now, you can't have it both ways. You can't have Mrs. Kirkpatrick telling us that things have never been better with Soviet-American relations, and Congressman Kemp saying they've never been worse.
Let me explain something to you. There is a sense in which, when you are dealing with a sworn enemy, in which your relations improve to the extent that that enemy recognizes that he is not going to successfully destroy you. There's a sense in which the bully gets along well with the person he's bullying if the bully becomes convinced that it's an unprofitable engagement. I think that as long as Ronald Reagan or his successor, George Bush, are in the White House, there will not be a nuclear initiative by the Soviet Union, because there is no doubt what our response would be. God knows what the response of George Dukakis would be. We know that he won't even permit Massachusetts to harbor anything except pollution. A lot depends on that.
Let me just say Governor Dukakis has always been in the mainstream of the Democratic Party and could be counted on to see that this country has a defense that's fully adequate, and he wouldn't be afraid to use it if necessary. Now, let me ask you one more question here. Do you think that the Reagan administration's sale of arms to Iran served to strengthen our position in dealing with the Soviets in
No, I
the
don't,
country?
but I think it might have. That is to say, the intention. If you want me to say, can I point to things that went wrong in any presidential administration, I can start on Jefferson. I can start on John Adams. I can give you a lot of things about the alien sedition laws that I think were wrong. The fact is, an attempt to appeal to the moderate element of an important country is significant diplomacy. I applaud his having done so. I regret very much that it didn't work, and terribly regret the extent to which you people have exploited it.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'm going to find out from Mr. Buckley afterwards whether this man, George Dukakis, he says is running for president this year, is related to Alger Stevenson, who Mr. Nixon said was running in 1952. Now I call on Ambassador Warnke and Dr. Kissinger to take the stand. And Dr. Kissinger, would you like to question Mr. Warnke?
Well, Paul, you nominated us as fellow moderates.
I think of us that way, yes. Yeah.
My concern is that Governor Dukakis does not represent the moderate elements in the Democratic Party, and I'd like to ask you a number of questions. One, what do you think is the reason why the Soviet Union has been more prepared to negotiate in recent years than in the few years than previously?
I think really, Henry, that the Soviet Union has been prepared to negotiate ever since you made a major breakthrough back in 1972. Another breakthrough in 1974, where you established the principle of equal ceilings. It was the only way that we were able to get a SALT II treaty in 1979. They have been willing to negotiate. They walked away from the bargaining table, I think, in a very ill-considered move after we deployed the Pershings and the ground-launched cruise missiles. Mr. Gorbachev had sense enough to come back. But apart from that hiatus, they've been there at the bargaining table, and I thank you for bringing them there.
So you see no substantial difference in the Gorbachev foreign policy and the policy previous to it?
Oh, I see a great difference. What I am saying is that there is no real difference as far as American foreign policy is concerned. The moderates have been in charge. We've been able to make deals. Now, fortunately, the Reagan administration has Mr. Gorbachev, and I'd rather deal with Mr. Gorbachev than certainly than Mr. Brezhnev. No question about that. It's been easier. They had a much easier task. But I think that the policy has been quite consistent, and I regret the fact that this debate appears to make it sort of a fight between the Republicans and the Democrats. It should not be. Arms control is a bipartisan policy. Nuclear war isn't good for Republicans. For one thing, they're fatter and they burn easier.
Now, do you believe, when one reads Governor Dukakis' statements on defense policy, there isn't a weapon he doesn't find absurd in the strategic field?
I don't think that's
absurd,
true.
preposterous. Well, name one that he is in favor of.
The Trident II missile.
No, what he says about the Trident II missile is that he is in favor of continuing developing it, which is practically completed. But
No, I think what he said is that you ought to deploy it, but maximize the range and minimize the counterforce capability. I think that's exactly what he said, and he's perfectly correct.
Well,
it meets the criterion, then, of stabilizing nuclear weapons.
No, we already have a Trident missile that has range.
But the Trident I is 4,000 nautical miles. The Trident II properly armed is 6,000.
Well, we're
nautical
reading
miles.
different things. What I have read is that he said we should develop it, but we probably will not have to deploy it in case of an arms control agreement because we already have too many warheads.
I think that if, in fact, you end up with an arms control agreement in which you can trade it off for asymmetrical reductions in Soviet MIRVed land-based ICBMs, it'd be a very good deal. But apart from that, you go ahead.
But a strategy that places the responsibility on the President of the United States to initiate nuclear war in which the only objective can be civilian population and in which the counterblow guarantees the devastation of American civilian populations, in what sense can that be considered a strategy and not nihilism?
Henry, as you know, there has never been such a strategy. We've had the ability for many, many years. When I was in the Pentagon back in the 1960s, I was thoroughly familiar with targeting policies, and they were not genocide policies. What they aimed to do was to destroy the infrastructure of the Soviet Union. We still have that ability. We've had it for many years. We'll continue to have it.
But when you say that the purpose should be not accuracy, but range, it is fundamentally a strategy aimed at civilian destruction.
No, what I'm talking about is the ability to come within a few feet of hardened Soviet missile silos. Striking infrastructure does not require that degree of accuracy. We have the degree of accuracy to strike infrastructure. We've had it for many, many years.
Okay, Mr. Warnke, now you have a chance to lob a few over at Dr. Kissinger.
Yeah. Henry, one of the things I'd like to know, do you support the INF Treaty? Do you think it's a good idea?
I did not think the INF Treaty in the form in which it was developed was a good idea. But let me make a point. Some of you people who attack on this point remind me of this. A house has been built in which there was a constant attack on the architecture, on the design, and then when the interior decoration occurs, you say you love the interior decoration. I like the house. I don't like the interior decoration. I think we should have made a different type of agreement achieving the same objective. But I like the design. I think the fundamental strategy of the administration was correct. In its particular outcome, I had serious reservations about it. I finally endorsed the particular treaty. I would have preferred another treaty.
Which would have been different in what respect?
It would have been different in the respect that we would have kept some of these weapons in Europe. We would have cut these weapons in Europe by 50% and made the reduction of the next 50% dependent on a substantial Soviet conventional withdrawal. The Soviet conventional threat produced the danger to European security. The Soviet conventional threat remains. That was my objection. But we would never have been in the position to make any agreement if the strategy of nuclear freeze and nuclear production freeze that Governor Dukakis has advocated would have been implemented.
The fact is, as you very well know, the idea of the deployment of the Pershings and Ground-Launched Cruise Missiles took place during the Carter administration in November of 1979.
Right. And I supported it.
It was a NATO decision at that point. So it's not a left-right decision. I supported the deployment of the Pershings and the Ground-Launched Cruise Missiles.
Yes, but Governor Dukakis opposed it.
No, I don't believe he did. No.
No, he was just opposed to producing the missile.
At the time that he supported what was then the freeze, it was after that decision and deployment.
Oh, no.
No, you're wrong. You're totally wrong. Yeah.
He was in favor of a production freeze at a time when the production was going on.
I think that if you look at his statements, if you look at mine at that point, we favored a selective freeze, and a freeze that would not have interfered with the deployment of the intermediate-range nuclear forces in Europe. There was widespread support on the Democratic side for that deployment. I think that we recognize that you could not let the Soviet Union overrule a NATO weapons decision. And whatever your other view was, it would have made no sense. So there was widespread support from the Democratic side. I think if you look at the record, you'll find that that is the case. But apart from that, Henry, look at the ABM Treaty, which I regard as your major accomplishment. Do you favor repudiation of the ABM Treaty at this point?
I favor that after 16 years, we should negotiate with the Soviets limitations on deployment of SDI that are compatible with limitations on deployment of offensive weapons. I do not favor singling out defensive limitations as a price for offensive limitations that make no significant strategic difference.
Is it true, though, that back in the 1970s, when you were basically in charge of strategic arms negotiations?
President Nixon was in charge, but I was...
No, I think that, Henry, it's extraordinarily modest of you to say that, and I accept it. But isn't it true that you accepted the fact that if we went ahead, or they went ahead, with a defensive deployment, neither one of us could afford to have dramatic cuts in our offensive striking force, for fear we would give the other side a first strike potential? You know, that's why we got into the SALT talks, as you well know. You and I talked about it back in the 1960s. We were worried about the Soviet strategic defense. We developed the MIRVs as a response.
I believe that it is possible to develop a first-stage SDI system that reduces the incentive for a first strike by protecting our strategic missiles, and to develop an SDI that protects our population against third-country attacks and small-scale Soviet attacks to reduce the danger of blackmail by raising the threshold. If they are determined on mutual extermination, if they're that mad, that probably cannot be prevented at the present stage of technology. But that's quite different from saying that the United States must forever leave its population open to the vagaries.
No one has said that. We've maintained, I think all of us, we ought to have a research program.
All right, thank you both.
To find out whether there's a technology.
Thank you, both of you. Thank you. Mr. Buckley, please take a stand. You will now, according to the rules, submit to a brief examination by, we'll start with Senator Hart.
Mr. Buckley, in all honesty now, when Ronald Reagan went to the Kremlin and threw his arms around the General Secretary of the Communist Party, didn't you suffer just a twang of...
Oh, yes. He thought he was back in Hollywood.
Yes. Well, doesn't that worry you?
Yes, it does, yeah.
What are we going to do about this?
Well, I've seen people overcome by a kind of synthetic hospitality.
And that happened to the... that happened to the President of the United States?
He didn't take the occasion to formulate strategy for the following decade. He came home and sobered up.
Well, you leave a very uncomfortable suggestion as to his conduct.
Look, you've seen pictures of FDR with his arm around Stalin, haven't you? You've seen Harry Truman saying, "I liked old Joe." That's what people do at summit conferences, which is one of the reasons I'm less enthusiastic than some people are about them.
Mrs. Schroeder, you.
I wanted to ask a bit, too, about the whole premise of the debate. I mean, you're saying the right can deal better, and I agree with Mr. McGovern in thinking that that's tainted a bit, that you're trying to slant it. But one of the interesting things to me is you look at the whole background and you would never guess that Richard Nixon would have gone to China, and yet he did. And who would have ever thought that Ronald Reagan would have been waltzing in the Kremlin? And there he was. Maybe it's that when they do that, then the right suddenly becomes quiet. We on the left, we're Democrats, I guess we're not that organized, and we'll still protest if we think our leader's doing something wrong. But
well, and Chamberlain went to Munich. Sometimes these things work, sometimes they do not work. Secretary Kissinger said right after they returned from China, look, I was not responsible for the atmospherics. You remember at one point after that first banquet, Richard Nixon got up and embraced all of these killers, one after another, with his little liqueur glass. As I wrote at the time, I was there, I saw it. It happened 15 feet from where I was standing. I said, I was surprised he didn't embrace Alger Hiss while he was at it. The fact is that the melodrama of situations like that do take over. However, it's absolutely correct that it was a brilliant strategic salient coming at that particular moment. It would have been nicer if Mao Zedong had died earlier. On the other hand, it would have been nicer if he hadn't ever lived.
I guess my real question would have been, though, if a Democrat had done that, don't you think he would have written different columns?
Well, no, because I didn't. I would have written the identical column. I would have written the identical column because I was very much against that initiative.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Buckley. Sorry, you'll get another chance. Senator McGovern. Someone over there have a question for Senator McGovern? Mr. Kemp.
Yeah, I'd like to ask George a question. Senator, you have talked about strategic defense. I forget your exact term, but whether it was a boondoggle or a fantasy.
Cockeyed.
Cockeyed, right. And Gary called it quixotic, and Michael Dukakis has suggested it is a fantasy. It's interesting that one of our best allies in the world, Israel, is taking the Strategic Defense Initiative technology and is signed a memorandum of understanding with the United States to deploy on the ground within 2 or 3 years in Israel an anti-tactical ballistic missile defense system using strategic defense technology. They don't think it's a fantasy. They don't think it's cockeyed. And the United States entering this alliance with Israel and soon to enter an alliance with European allies for an ATBM system using SDI technology. Why would it be a fantasy and quixotic or cockeyed for the United States when to Israel and to Europe it represents a defense against a very real ballistic missile threat to their survival?
Jack, I think it's very difficult to know even what the proponents of SDI think it's going to do, the Star Wars system. When the president first unveiled it, he told us it would make nuclear weapons obsolete. We could forget worrying about nuclear weapons because we'd have an airtight shield over the United States and nobody would ever be able to touch us. Now, I think we all know, critics and supporters alike, that that's a fantasy. That's all you can call that.
Well, it's not a fantasy.
Well, it is.
to
It's a
Israel.
fantasy in the sense that nobody really expects SDI to provide an airtight shield. If it kept 10% of a nuclear attack from hitting the United States, that would be a 10% success. If it kept 90% out, it would be a 90% success. But in either case, most of the American people would die because 10% of the Soviet strike force, as it now stands, would destroy most of the United States. So the answer to the legitimate fears of all of us about nuclear war is to continue negotiating arrangements under which the offensive forces on both sides are steadily reduced. I give President Reagan great credit for the breakthrough on INF. I give him credit for the informal understanding we now have that there may be as much as a 50% reduction in offensive weapons on both sides. The sticking point on that is his insistence on SDI. If we can get rid of 50% of the Soviet weapons now targeted on the United States without costing us a dime under a verifiable system, why not do it? Why pursue this will-o'-the-wisp that might work and might not work, but may end up costing us $1 trillion and giving us the illusion of defense where there is none? All right.
Thank you, Senator. It's now time for Congresswoman Schroeder and Congressman Kemp to take a stand. You have 5 minutes to interrogate Mrs. Schroeder.
You've been waiting for this, right?
Well, Pat, pleasure to be with you.
Good to be here.
And particularly the governor of South Carolina and his lovely wife, Iris and Carol Campbell. May I say in their presence and the presence of all these friends that I have great respect for the Democratic Party. I agree with everything that's been said here tonight that we do need a bipartisan foreign policy. Isn't it possible that this president, a conservative president, a man of the right, has made a breakthrough in the relations with the Soviet Union that are of unprecedented proportions? to the extent that, notwithstanding the fact that he went to the Soviet Union and put his arm around Gorby, he also lectured, he also is the first American president, to go into Moscow and lecture at Moscow State University about democracy, about freedom and private property, about human rights for Jews and Christians and dissidents, about the ability of entrepreneurial democratic capitalism to liberate the potential of human beings all over the world. Isn't that a remarkable breakthrough for a man of the right to put America in the position of watching the worldwide collapse of socialism, watching democracy and democratic capitalism transcend communism as he predicted, notwithstanding the need to be strong? Isn't it possible that Ronald Reagan has done more to break through the stagnation of the relations with the Soviet Union than some of the most liberal democratic presidents of, say, the past 20 years?
Well, certainly. I think everybody in the country, in the world, salutes the progress that's happened. There's no question. I think the INF Treaty has got some precedents in it we never thought would happen. Many times. We never thought it would happen. On-site verification, no one thought that would happen. Asymmetrical reductions, where they bring down way more than we do, so we get to zero, no one ever thought that would happen. That's wonderful. I am absolutely delighted that we did finally get one set of words coming out of the President's mouth rather than another. Now, I'm not totally convinced, and I don't think you are either, that the President, or that the Soviet Union is ready to join capitalism rather than bury it. No. So I don't think we just all celebrate, go out and have champagne and say this is it. I think you still have to be terribly vigilant. You continue to negotiate with them. Why? Because you don't trust them. I mean, we don't negotiate with people we trust, for heaven's sakes. We trust the Canadians. Why would we go negotiate a treaty with them? Obviously, we're the two superpowers, and we've got to watch them. But any progress we can make, I think it's very important. But if your premise is the reason he's doing this is because he was tough and so forth, that may be a part, but I think it's just a part. I think the Soviet Union is also looking at the world in the future. The Soviet Union is seeing a united Europe come together in '92 that will have a larger gross national product than the United States. The Soviet Union is seeing Japan be a player all over the world with very strong economic influence, and realizing their economy is abominable. And they got to figure out how they're going to play in the future. And so I think they're desperately looking at that. They're also looking at China, that found out that, you know, communism is not working well there. So I think they're trying to speed up. I don't think it was just that we had more men. I mean, otherwise they would have capitulated in '45. We had it all.
I don't either just think that it was that. I happen to think that despite the attack on the economy from friends on the left, it is interesting that today in the world, there is absolutely no country, maybe other than Nicaragua, Ethiopia, and Cuba, that still believes in socialism. But worldwide, we're seeing a resurgence of democratic capitalism. Right. Democracy is on the march in our hemisphere. Not so long ago, when Jimmy Carter was president of the United States, our economy was in a shambles. Our defense spending had dropped to 4.9% of gross national product, the lowest in the probably the post-World War II period. We had no ability, notwithstanding the support of the deployment of Pershings and Glickums, ground-launched cruise missiles in Europe. They hadn't been done. The Soviet Union was deploying a backfire bomber once every 10 days, an SS-20 once every 5 days, building a nuclear sub probably once a month, and there was no response other than to stop the Soviets and the United States from going to the Olympic Games. Now, under a Republican president, the economy has made a recovery, notwithstanding the fact that I want it to be stronger. And I want to ask you the question. With this good news in the world, isn't it possible that even Pat Schroeder could find something nice to say about a Republican president who has led the world towards a position where every country in Europe and most countries of Asia are celebrating the resurgence of this democratic spirit?
Mrs. Schroeder, find something nice to say if you can, and then go on the offensive.
I think I did. I think I said I was delighted to see him there and doing that, but I don't think it's over, and I think we got a lot to do.
Well, I agree.
Let me say, I also wanted to pose something to you, because in your opening statement, you made a very important comment that I don't think's been answered here tonight. You stood here and you said, all right, how do we deal with Soviet violations of ABM? How do we deal with Soviet violations of Helsinki and so forth? And I think those are all terribly critical, because I said one of the things the president must do is be leaders of democracies, and the Soviet Union is clearly not. Does it trouble you at all that not one NATO ally has ever condemned the Soviet Union for violations of the ABM Treaty?
Very much so.
And don't you think one of the failures, maybe not just of Reagan, but Carter, of all sorts of people, is we have not gotten our allies to be more responsible and more mature, and that's a way, I think, that the Soviets will respond. If the world gangs up on them, then they're going to start shaping up.
I agree, but absent the universal condemnation of Soviet behavior in Helsinki or Yalta or SALT I or SALT II or ABM, it really is up to the United States, whether we like it or not, and whether we think we've entered Gary Hart's Brave New World, where the world is shifting away from U.S. influence and power. I am still convinced that whether we like it or not, the United States on this world scene is the one country on this earth that can positively affect the human rights and the economic conditions and the hope for peace and prosperity of most of the world. And thank God there is a United States today led by a president who shares that conviction that in the absence of unilateral condemnation, we must act even if it is unilateral.
Jack, I think you missed. I think you missed what I was really trying to say.
All right.
What I am trying to say is, you started out by saying how we have had a great victory on this planet in that more and more countries are moving towards capitalism, realizing socialism is great. You know what that means for us? We're going to have to be much more competitive in the future. And we all know that. And to be more competitive, or we can't afford to go out and protect the whole world. We're only 6% of the world's population.
I agree
now,
with that too.
when you stand there and say, we're here, we're going to do it, you're doing the dial 1-800-USA.
let me answer the
and
question.
everybody else says, we don't have to worry because the U.S. is going to keep doing it.
Before I run out of time, I would like to answer that question. I think it was important to flag those ships in the Persian Gulf, not for oil alone, but to keep the Persian Gulf open, to keep the Soviet Navy out of the Persian Gulf.
We didn't have
and
to
I
do
would
it.
suggest, Pat, that the reason there's a chance to get an Iran-Iraq ceasefire and Iran-Iraq modus vivendi of whatever sorts it ends up is because Reagan took the position unilaterally, absent action by our allies, to go ahead and flag those ships, which you make so light of here tonight.
He didn't seek their advice first. And I
disagree
think
with
you
that.
are defining
I disagree
leadership
with that.
as unilateral action. I define leadership as getting our allies that we have helped to come and join us.
I think
we're in trouble if we don't move that way.
I think leadership, Pat, was the willingness to go ahead and liberate Grenada, even though he was criticized by 99% of the Democratic Party liberals in the United States Congress. Reagan did it, and the students came home and kissed the ground and thanked
Margaret
Reagan
Thatcher
for liberating Grenada.
And Margaret Thatcher also criticized. Let me just respond, because again, I think Ronald Reagan did not call Margaret Thatcher. They were the protector of that island, and I think that had he done that and said, hey, I've got some really troubling intelligence reports here, Maggie, what do you have, and let's work it out and let's do it, that may have kept them a little happier, and I don't see making anyone like Margaret Thatcher unhappy when they have responsibility in that area. But again, I think you're defining leadership as unilateral action, and that troubles me. I have just got a few more minutes left, or very few seconds left. Let me ask you, I have been in the Congress, obviously on the Armed Services Committee, trying to do all sorts of Pentagon procurement reform. And you're always on the other side. That truly troubles me.
Other side of what?
Of the procurement reform thing.
Well, what evidence do you have that I'm on the other side of procurement reform?
Your vote.
Well, my vote for what?
Well,
is there a vote you want to share with this audience?
I'll give some votes. What would you like? I got some votes here. How about,
don't
let me give you the vote.
Put words in my mouth.
Number
I am
one.
not against procurement reform. I happen to think that competitive bidding is the most important procurement reform that we can possibly emulate.
What
because
about
we need
criminal
competition for those
penalties for people who are caught ripping off the Defense Department?
Oh, there should be a penalty. It's against the law. There's a violation of the law at stake, and anybody that violates the law should be prosecuted.
You voted for civilian penalties, and we were pushing criminal. It's a criminal penalty to even defraud in Medicare. I mean, I think you shouldn't be so soft on these guys, and I think one of the things that we've had trouble with is that we keep buying a lot of things and we've gotten sold equipment
This is a
that
good
doesn't work.
difference between the left and the right. I happen to think, despite the mistakes, and they should be prosecuted for making those mistakes and violating the law,
should vote
but I
that
happen
way.
to believe today that our defense and military industrial complex, muchly maligned, is still as much today the arsenal of democracy as it was in the 1940s and as it ever was. We need the proper leadership to enhance its ability to provide for the defense of this country, and I think this clearly is a difference between those of us on this side of the panel and those of
Thank
you
you
on the
both.
left.
I think
Thank
we
you
got
both.
it made to
Thank
account.
you both. Mrs. Kirkpatrick. Now the team on the left will have an opportunity to interrogate Jeane Kirkpatrick. Who would like to start? Mr. Warnke?
Good heavens. Mrs. Kirkpatrick, Congressman Kemp talked about the fact that we have technology that will, in fact, provide a defense of the United States against missiles from the Soviet Union. Do you believe that?
I believe that we have very important components of the technology of a missile defense system, that some of these are operational, some are near operational, and some are further from completion. I not only believe that myself, but I know that most of the most advanced science in our society believe it. And I know that Mikhail Gorbachev believes it, and most of the most advanced scientists in the Soviet Union, military technology, believe it. And I know that the government of Israel believes it. And as a matter of fact, all over the world today, one finds governments coming to take missile defense more and more and more seriously.
The fact of the matter is that Andrei Sakharov does not believe it. The fact of the matter is that the
I think
American
that's not a
Association
fact,
of
in
the
fact.
Advancement of Science does not
I'm
believe
sorry,
it.
I think that's not a fact.
The fact of the matter is
I've
that
heard Andrei Sakharov say
the
the
Office of
contrary.
Technological Assessment of the United States Congress does not
No, I'm
believe it.
sorry. I'm afraid those are facts that are not facts.
No, I think they are facts that
Andrei Sakharov has said no such thing, and as a matter
Oh, he
of fact,
has. He said it to me.
No, but I too have
to me.
spoken with Andrei Sakharov. Secretary Kissinger and I spent an evening with Sakharov and heard him take a different position on SDI than he had been quoted as taking, and specifically, by the way, advocated decoupling SDI and research on missile defense from arms negotiations, which some people were arguing in favor of and which he had been attributed to be in favor of. He specifically argued against it because I think it was clear that he understood that both governments were, in fact, going to proceed with research and testing of missile deployment.
What he told me
Yes.
was that we should de-link it because there was nothing that the Soviet Union had to worry about in terms of strategic defense because it would not work.
Then he must have been accusing Mikhail Gorbachev of a kind of fantasy.
Oh, no.
That I wouldn't dream of doing, let me say. I think Mr. Gorbachev is a very realistic man.
Senator
And-
McGovern. Yes. Senator McGovern.
Jeane, I think it's generally understood that we're spending as a country a higher percentage of our gross national product on defense than either Japan or Western Europe. We're also using 60% of our entire defense budget to defend Japan and Western Europe at a time when they're very prosperous nations. They're no longer in disrepair as they were when this business began. Don't you think the time has come for us to shift some of the burden of collective defense to these prosperous allies we've been defending so generously all these years? And if so, would that open the way for substantial reductions in our own military outlays so we could do some of the other things we need to do here in the United States?
Well, I think the answer to that, George, is yes. I think the time has come that some of our rich, smart friends in Western Europe and in Japan, for example, should assume a larger share of the burden of their own defense and of stability in their own regions. I believe that very strongly. And I do not doubt that we can make good use of the monies saved in the process. And as a matter of fact, that they will be stronger for the responsibilities that they assume for themselves. I also believe that the United States can afford a missile defense, which I think is a threat to us. And I think that if we have some money left over to do a very wide range of things that need to be done at home and abroad, then I'm in favor of spending that money for constructive purposes. Some of the purposes, by the way, which our rich, smart friends already are spending money for themselves on.
No, let's give Congressman Schroeder a chance.
I just want to say I'm delighted that you agree on burden sharing, because I really think as we look to the future, that's where we've got to go. And I want to salute you for what I thought you were doing in the UN. You were doing some of that in the UN, weren't you?
I was trying.
Weren't you staying in your seat sometimes and making some of them come forward when they didn't want to?
I sure did.
And hadn't there been an awful long time of really allies who know better, just comfortably staying in their seat and figuring you'd pick up the fight?
I believe very strongly that one of the burdens that we need to share more fairly, let's say, with our allies is the burden of response. And I believe that it is very important for us from time to time to exercise restraint in assuming the burdens that our friends are entirely capable of bearing. And I think we must develop, or should develop, a habit of doing that. And I did find in the United Nations, when the United States ceased assuming the burdens of unilaterally defending the industrial world, for example, or in peace and stability, and hung back, so to speak, to give our allies the opportunity to assume, to step forward. If we waited long enough, they did. I think that was good for us and good for them. And I'm pleased that you approved that.
Do you want your follow-up? Go ahead,
Yes,
Senator.
Jeane, on the SDI, which you support, some of the other supporters say at best it's not going to knock down more than 50% of incoming missiles. If that's true, and it costs us, say, $1 trillion to accomplish that, why not go ahead with the arrangement that now beckons to get rid of half of the Soviet missiles without the SDI, providing we're willing to get rid of half of ours? Who gets hurt by that?
Please.
I'd much rather have, I'm happy to get rid of half of Soviet missiles and have the SDI to get rid of the other half.
It's time for Senator Hart to take the stand and withstand a barrage of attacks from the right. Congressman Kemp.
Gary, we all applaud perestroika and what it means, or the hope, I should say, of what it means to the future. My position has always been that we shouldn't underwrite it. And it's pretty clear that we are providing low-interest loans to stimulate trade, apparently, with the Soviet Union at a couple points under the prime rate, or at least 1 or 2 points under prime rate. What's your view about perestroika and whether or not it should be underwritten by Western consortiums of banks that are helping to underwrite this experiment in liberalization, if that's what it ends up as being?
Well, leaving the question of subsidization of loans to the side for the moment, I can't think any other way than it's in our long-term interest to have Western interests doing business there in non-strategic ways. It is bound to ameliorate their own society, to bring Western culture, or our version of Western culture, to them, and make them more dependent on a consumer-oriented economy and less dependent on a military-oriented economy. I happen to accompany about 500 top American business executives, of whom I would assume 95% will vote for George Bush, to the Soviet Union in April with a U.S.-USSR Trade Council mission, its 11th or 12th year, created by a Republican president called Richard Nixon. And these individuals were extremely interested in doing business in the Soviet Union. My own view, if it's non-strategic, is that can only be in our interest and theirs.
Well, they have more Soviet troops in Czechoslovakia today, 20 years after the Czech Spring, Prague Spring, than
What's that
more
got to
troops
do
in
with-
Czechoslovakia
What's
than
that got to do
U.S.
with
troops in
anything?
Europe. Well, did you see any reduction in military efforts by the Soviet Union in your travels?
I think what we are seeing from Mr. Gorbachev, and we're not now talking about perestroika so much as some initiatives that I think he's making behind the scenes, is an increasing effort on his part to move his own senior officials in the direction of autonomy, more autonomy for the Eastern Bloc countries. I think we're beginning to see it more in the Baltic states, and I think increasing, well, Jack.
Well,
Okay,
it's to the Lithuanians.
Now, Mr. Buckley, I think we should give a shot. Senator.
Senator, maybe you can clarify a mystification launched here by Senator McGovern, your colleague. He's talking about, wouldn't you rather reduce the inventory of weapons by the Soviet Union on the ground than in the air? Now, I find it difficult to accost that question because if they're in the air and we get only half of them, the other half are going to kill us, right? So therefore, the whole objective of the exercise is to keep them from being launched in the first instance. Now, if they have, let's say, 10,000 now and they are reduced to 5,000, that's still a lethal force. If they reduce that to 2,500, it's still a lethal force. But it ceases to be a lethal force if they are afraid of launching a first strike on the grounds that we can intercept enough of them to make it a conclusive military exercise, and giving us, therefore, a retaliatory option.
I believe Senator McGovern's position was that it costs us, it saves us about $1 trillion to sit at a bargaining table in Geneva.
You're not underwriting that figure, are you?
And negotiate.
I mean, that's funny paper stuff.
Well, it certainly is the way this administration.
Well, the George Marshall Institute, using Harold Brown's figures, comes to 130 billion, i.e. 10 times the cost of research and development.
I think, with all due respect, I think that's absolutely wrong. I don't want to
is
debate.
Harold Brown wrong, or is George Marshall Institute wrong? Who's wrong? Me?
Rules, yes.
But I'm just quoting
Perish
them.
the thought, Mr. Buckley, I think you're wrong.
Well, let's let the thought perish then and answer who is wrong, Harold Brown or the George Marshall Institute?
I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is, for those of us who have been briefed either on armed services or intelligence committees,
Who briefed you on the $1 trillion? Give me the name of one person.
May I finish my statement? The cost of the entire system, as calculated by representatives of this administration, the entire system as proposed by the President at the outset, not some initial phase or whatever we're talking about now, the umbrella concept was in the range of $1 trillion.
Right. Dr. Kissinger, would you like to pose a question?
You seem to suggest that helping the Soviets economically would automatically ease international relations because they would pick, it could.
Could.
But it is, would you agree that if you look at Russian history for 400 years under Tsars and Commissars, they have been expanding in all directions in every century? And therefore, why would this not be the occasion to insist that we get a deal on restrained international behavior before we help them, rather than expect that they will become restrained if they become stronger?
I'm not advocating that we help them economically, and I don't think we ought to underwrite perestroika. What I'm saying is that I think something like market forces are being introduced here, and that can only benefit us and our strategic interests. If Western business...
Why does it help us to have a stronger Soviet Union if the Soviet Union does not change its international behavior?
Does it make the Soviet Union stronger to be buying Levi's off the shelf and Sony Walkman and things like that? How does that make them stronger?
Well, if they buy Levi's, it may not necessarily make them stronger, but if it creates greater cohesion in the Soviet society, it will give them a greater capacity.
I don't see that Levi's and Sony Walkman have created cohesion in ours. Why should it in theirs?
Well, the issue surely is not the Soviets do not want Levi's from us. The Soviets want high technology. They want us to improve their industrial machinery, and they want us to solve the problem of management that they
What
cannot
they
solve
want-
within a communist system.
What they want and what they get are probably two different things.
Well, my point is simply that in order to get something,
Okay.
they ought to reassure us on the questions that have scared
Very
all their
quickly.
neighbors.
I would urge this administration to do that and to have done it.
Thank you, Senator. Okay, it's time. The team captain of the left, Senator George McGovern, is now invited to summarize his team's case.
I think American political battles ordinarily, including this one tonight, are not fought at the extremes between left and right, but as you have seen, are fought largely in the center between liberals and conservatives, with no unbridgeable chasm between us, as witness the fact that the Republican members of the panel tonight cite Democrats consistently as their heroes, albeit dead Democrats. But I believe that our relations with the Soviet Union, as others have said here tonight, have gone best when we've had a broad bipartisan base. And this is what I hope will emerge no matter who wins this election in 1988. Do we have the will and the wisdom at this crucial time in the life of our relationship with the Soviet Union and other countries to pursue foreign policy objectives that serve the interests not only of ourselves, but all the people who covet peace around the world? I personally agree with Congressman Kemp when he said that all of us here endorse Gorbachev's perestroika, the moves that he's made in a more peaceful and constructive direction. It makes it all the more puzzling that the Republican vice presidential candidate, Dan Quayle, said yesterday that Mr. Gorbachev's proposals, including perestroika, are nothing but warmed over Stalinism. I think anyone with that lack of understanding of the new opportunities we have for improved relationships with the Soviet Union is not qualified to be President of the United States. We are all familiar with the fundamental differences that exist between the Soviet Union and the United States. Those differences are clear, and some of them will remain. But what we have to concentrate on now are the areas of mutual interest that exist between these two great superpowers. Heading the list is the mutual interest in survival. Presumably, Russian mothers and fathers weep for their children, even as we do, and are interested in some way of turning away the nuclear monster. The necessity of arriving at some agreement on the environment and other issues. These, I think, are things that the Democratic left can handle more effectively than the Republican right.
Thank you, Senator McGovern. Mr. Buckley.
Mr. Chairman, I am most interested tonight in something said early on by Mr. Warnke. He said the right have no interest in dealing with the Soviet Union. It seems to me that that statement incorporates the misunderstanding that illuminates the differences between us. If I and my entire family had spent the last 70 years arming ourselves, intending the elimination of the Warnke clan, I would suggest that he would have no interest in dealing with me except to the extent that I agreed to lay aside my aggressive intentions. Now, we talk about INF Treaty as though it were epical in its significance. We should remind ourselves that there's been a net reduction of 3.5% in the nuclear reserves of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union at this moment has at its disposal 500 million times the explosive power of the bomb that went off over Hiroshima, and most of that is aimed at us. What evidence have we that the Soviet Union has in fact adjourned its intentions to rule the world? We are trapped by the notion that we're both superpowers. Why don't we do this when they do that? But they have been the aggressors. It is written into their charter that they are the aggressors. to say that we in the Soviet Union are to be compared is the equivalent of saying that the man who pushes the old lady into the way of an oncoming bus and the man who pushes the old lady out of the way of an oncoming bus are both people who push old ladies around. The fact of the matter is that we need an administration whose roots are in the realism rather than in the surrealism that has characterized the left's continual delusions about the Soviet Union and its objectives. We can see in the record of George Bush something of that nature. In the record of Michael Dukakis, we see this total abject confusion, as though he had been brought into a world which he cannot understand, but pending his understanding of it, he desires to be President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief. We can't afford it.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm sure I speak for all of us here in the hall and people watching to say I'm delighted that's all settled now. Thank you very much, panelists of the left. Thank you very much, panelists of the right. We'll be back in about a month to settle all the domestic issues as well. Thank you very much, South Carolina Public Television, and good night.
Chemical, Mobil Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line. For a printed bound transcript. Firing line debate was made possible in part by the John M. Olin Foundation, Essex Chemical, Mobil Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line. For a printed bound transcript of this special Firing Line debate, send $5 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29250. Indicate the subject and please allow 3 weeks for delivery.